September 8, 1941. The sky above Leningrad burned. Alexey Fedorovich Boyko pressed leather headphones against his ears and turned slowly in his chair, listening through the roar of explosions. He could not see the flames consuming the city behind him. He had been blind since birth. But in the darkness that had always been his world, he could hear what others could not. The distant drone of Junkers, Ju-87 engines, 27 kilometers away, still invisible to every sighted soldier in the city, coming fast. His fingers moved across the calibrated wheel. The sound amplification tubes rotated in smooth arcs. The engine noise grew louder in his right ear, softer in his left. He made minute adjustments until the sound balanced perfectly in both channels. There, he had them. Boyko called out coordinates to his partner, a sighted soldier who stood ready at the telephone. Within seconds, searchlight crews across Leningrad sprang to action. Anti-aircraft batteries loaded shells and trained their barrels skyward. The city's defenders had 15 minutes to prepare, 15 minutes that would save hundreds of lives, because a blind man could hear what radar could not yet detect and human eyes could not yet see. This is the story of how the Soviet Union turned disability into devastating military advantage, how 12 blind men became the most critical component of Leningrad's air defense system during the longest and deadliest siege in human history, how extraordinary hearing became as powerful as any weapon, and how the darkest days of the Second World War revealed that sometimes the greatest strength lies in what others perceive as weakness. The siege of Leningrad began on that September day when German Army Group North completed its encirclement of the Soviet Union's second-largest city. Adolf Hitler had made a strategic decision that would define the next 872 days. Here, rather than commit his forces to costly urban warfare, he would starve Leningrad into submission, he would bomb it into dust, and he would do both with methodical German efficiency. The Führer's directive was explicit and brutal. Leningrad would not be captured, it would be erased, every building reduced to rubble, every citizen dead from starvation or bombardment. The city would serve as a lesson to other Soviet populations about the cost of resistance. The Luftwaffe launched its campaign immediately. On September 8 alone, 178 fires erupted across the city from German incendiary bombs. The Badaev warehouses containing much of Leningrad's food reserves burned for hours. Sugar melted and soaked into the earth. Flour turned to ash. The smell of burning grain and fat hung over the city like a funeral shroud. People would later dig up the earth around those warehouses, boiling the sugar-soaked soil to extract calories. But on that first day, they simply watched their future burn. 8 days later came the heaviest air raid Leningrad would experience during the entire war. 276 bombers arrived in 6 separate waves. They killed over 1,000 civilians in a single afternoon. They hit 5 hospitals, killing patients in their beds. They destroyed apartment buildings, entombing families in rubble. They cratered streets and shattered water mains. And they demonstrated with brutal clarity that Leningrad's survival depended entirely on its ability to detect and destroy incoming aircraft before they reached their targets. The problem was technological. In 1941, radar was still primitive. The Soviet Union possessed limited radar installations, and what existed was unreliable. The technology was new, temperamental, and often failed at critical moments. Early Soviet radar sets were based on British and captured German designs. They operated on long wavelengths that provided poor resolution. They could detect that something was airborne, but precision was limited. Range estimation was approximate. The number of aircraft in a formation was often indeterminate. And the systems required substantial electrical power, skilled technicians, and spare parts that were in desperately short supply during the siege. This left Soviet air defense forces dependent on an older technology that had been used since the First World War. Sound detection devices, acoustic locators, massive arrays of metal tubes and horns that could pick up the engine noise of aircraft at distance. The physics were straightforward. Aircraft engines produced distinctive sound signatures. Propeller-driven aircraft from the 1940s were particularly loud. The combination of piston engines and large propellers created low-frequency noise that propagated effectively through the atmosphere. By using large acoustic horns to collect and focus this sound, operators could detect aircraft long before they came into visual range. These devices were engineering marvels in their own right. Complex arrangements of tubes of varying diameters amplified sound waves from different directions. The largest tubes, used for detecting low-frequency engine noise at maximum range, could be over 3 meters long and 30 centimeters in diameter. Smaller horns detected higher frequencies at closer range. The entire apparatus was mounted on a rotating platform that could be turned to scan in any direction. Precision bearings allowed smooth rotation without introducing mechanical noise. The rotation had to be carefully controlled because any jerky movement would create acoustic artifacts that could mask aircraft signatures. The theoretical maximum detection range depended on atmospheric conditions, but under ideal circumstances, a skilled operator could hear aircraft at distances exceeding 35 kilometers. This represented detection times of 15 to 20 minutes before bombers reached the city, assuming typical approach speeds of 150 to 200 kilometers per hour. Those minutes were the difference between effective defense and catastrophic surprise. They allowed anti-aircraft crews to man their positions, searchlights to power up and orient toward the threat vector, and fighter aircraft to scramble and climb to intercept altitude. But there was a problem with the operators. Sighted soldiers assigned to acoustic listening posts were not very good at the job. They could hear the obvious. They could detect large formations of bombers when they were already close, when the combined engine noise became impossible to miss. But the subtle distinctions escaped them. The ability to pick out faint engine noise through the cacophony of a city under siege. The capacity to differentiate between Soviet aircraft returning to base and German raiders approaching for attack. The skill to identify specific aircraft types by engine signature alone. The ability to maintain concentration for hours while filtering out irrelevant sounds and focusing only on the narrow frequency band where aircraft engines resonated. These abilities required hearing that went beyond normal human capacity. The acoustic signature analysis itself was extraordinarily complex. A Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber was powered by a single Junkers Ju-Mode 211 12-cylinder inverted V engine. This produced a distinctive sound pattern. The engine fired with a specific rhythm determined by its firing order. The propeller, a 3-blade variable pitch unit, created its own acoustic signature as it sliced through air at high rotational speed. Together, these components produced a sound that a trained operator could identify. But identifying that sound required first hearing it amid all the background noise of an active battlefield. The Junkers Ju-88 medium bomber, by contrast, used twin Ju-Mode 211 engines. The dual-engine configuration created a different acoustic signature. The two engines never operated in perfect synchronization. There were always slight differences in RPM, creating a characteristic beating pattern where the sound waves from the two engines would constructively and destructively interfere. This beat frequency was distinctive. A skilled listener could hear it and know immediately that they were detecting a twin-engine aircraft. The Heinkel He L-11, another common German bomber over Leningrad, also used twin engines, but its DB6A101 engines had different acoustic characteristics than the Ju-Mode 211's. The cylinder configuration was different, the exhaust note was different. An experienced listener could distinguish between a Ju-88 and an E-17 by sound alone, even at ranges where the aircraft were invisible. Soviet aircraft had their own signatures that had to be memorized. The Petlyakov P-2 dive bomber used twin Klimov VK-105 engines. These were liquid-cooled V-112 engines based on French Hispano-Suiza designs. They sounded different from German engines. The Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft, which might return from missions and fly over Leningrad, had a single AM-38 engine that produced a distinctive deep rumble. Soviet fighters like the Yak-1 and La-GG-3 had smaller inline engines with their own characteristic sounds. The Soviet Air Defense Command in Leningrad recognized by late 1941 that their eavesdroppers were failing. Their acoustic detection network was providing insufficient warning. Aircraft reached the city with inadequate preparation time. Anti-aircraft batteries had no margin to acquire targets, compute firing solutions, and engage before bombers released their ordnance. Searchlights swept blindly across the sky, occasionally illuminating an aircraft by chance, but more often wasting their power. Fighter pilots scrambled too late to intercept effectively. People died in numbers that could have been reduced with better early detection. The entire integrated air defense system was degraded by the weakest link, human hearing. But what if the problem was not the equipment, but the operators? What if the solution required people whose hearing had developed beyond normal human limits through neurological adaptation? What if Leningrad's defense required blind soldiers? The neuroscience behind this insight was well established by 1941, though the Soviet military command may not have articulated it in modern neurological terms. When a human loses sight, the visual cortex does not simply go dark, the brain is remarkably plastic. Neural networks that would normally process visual information get repurposed for other sensory modalities. This is not a subtle effect. It is a massive reallocation of computational resources. The visual cortex occupies a substantial portion of the human brain. When that processing power gets redirected toward auditory processing, the results are dramatic. Blind individuals develop genuinely enhanced auditory capabilities. They can detect fainter sounds because their auditory cortex has more neural tissue dedicated to processing sound. They can distinguish subtler differences in frequency, amplitude, and timbre because they have more sophisticated signal processing happening in their brains. They can localize sounds more accurately because more computational power is available for processing interaural time differences and intensity differences. This is measurable. Put a blind person and a sighted person in a laboratory, play them identical sounds, and the blind person will consistently demonstrate superior auditory discrimination across virtually every metric. For acoustic detection of aircraft, this adaptation was potentially decisive. The difference between detecting a bomber at 20 kilometers versus 30 kilometers meant the difference between adequate warning time and catastrophic surprise. The difference between identifying aircraft type versus simply hearing generic engine noise meant the difference between preparing the right response and wasting precious seconds. The ability to maintain auditory focus for hours without degradation meant more reliable coverage and fewer missed detections. These marginal improvements, multiplied across hundreds of air raids over nearly 3 years, could save thousands of lives. The city still had a population of blind citizens. About 300 remained despite the siege. Many worked in workshops, making camouflage netting for buildings or gloves for soldiers. The workshops were part of the All-Russian Society for the Blind, an organization that predated the Soviet Union and provided employment and support for blind citizens. These workers performed genuinely valuable labor. Camouflage netting was essential for protecting buildings and equipment from aerial observation. Gloves were critical equipment for soldiers operating in the brutal Russian winter. The blind workers could perform these tasks as effectively as sighted workers, sometimes more effectively because their tactile senses were also enhanced. Some blind citizens performed in musical ensembles, providing entertainment to boost morale. They were piano tuners, accordion players, factory workers. Music was not a luxury during the siege, it was a lifeline. It reminded people that civilization still existed, that beauty had not been entirely destroyed, that there were reasons to survive beyond mere biological existence. The blind musicians contributed to this effort. Their performances in bunkers and shelters gave people strength to endure another day. They had survived the first terrible months of the siege, and they possessed something the military desperately needed: extraordinary hearing. The question was whether this civilian capability could be transformed into military effectiveness, whether blind men could become soldiers, whether disability could become strategic advantage. The military command approached this idea with appropriate skepticism. Recruiting blind soldiers violated every conventional assumption about military fitness. The physical requirements for military service typically included perfect or near-perfect vision. The assumption was that soldiers needed to see enemies, terrain, equipment. A blind soldier seemed like a contradiction in terms. But the acoustic detection specialty was different. For this specific role, blindness was not a disqualification, it was a qualification. The challenge was determining whether blind men could handle the other requirements of the job. They established rigorous selection criteria. First, they eliminated all women from consideration. This was not based on prejudice against women's hearing capabilities. Women's auditory processing is generally as good as men's, and blind women would have the same neurological adaptations as blind men. But the physical requirements of operating acoustic detection equipment were severe. The apparatus was massive and required physical strength to manipulate. The metal horns had to be rotated by hand through mechanical linkages. In winter, these mechanisms became stiff and required significant force to turn. The operators had to maintain fixed positions for hours despite discomfort. They had to endure brutal cold. During the worst periods of the siege, when rations were reduced to starvation levels, physical endurance became even more critical. The Soviet military made a practical calculation. Given the physical requirements and the siege conditions, most women would not be able to sustain the work. Male candidates, on average, had better prospects of meeting the endurance requirements. This was pragmatism, not ideology. Every recruit represented a significant investment of training time and scarce resources. The military needed candidates with the highest probability of success. Second, candidates underwent comprehensive medical examination. Blindness alone was insufficient qualification. They needed excellent overall health, strong cardiovascular systems to maintain cognitive function during long shifts, robust immune systems to resist the diseases that were rampant in siege conditions, no chronic conditions that would degrade performance or require medical resources that the city could not spare. The physical examination was thorough: blood pressure, heart rate, lung capacity, general constitution. Many volunteers were rejected on medical grounds. Third, candidates faced testing of their hearing abilities. This was the most critical assessment. They listened to recorded aircraft sounds and had to identify engine types. The recordings were played at low volume to simulate distant detection. They had to distinguish between Soviet and German aircraft by acoustic signature alone, with no visual cues. They demonstrated their ability to maintain focus despite distracting noise. Background sounds were added to the recordings. Explosions, machinery, conversations. The candidates had to filter out these irrelevant sounds and focus only on the aircraft signature. They proved they could process and communicate complex information rapidly and accurately under pressure. They were given simulated scenarios where they had to detect aircraft, estimate range and bearing, identify type, and communicate this information clearly within strict time limits. The testing protocols were sophisticated. Military psychologists and audiologists had designed them to simulate actual operational conditions as closely as possible. The goal was not just to assess raw auditory capability, but to evaluate the complete package of skills required for effective acoustic detection. Hearing, concentration, communication, stress tolerance, decision-making under uncertainty, all of these factors mattered. Of the 300 blind people remaining in Leningrad in early 1942, only 30 passed the initial medical screening. The attrition rate was 90%. Only 20 of those advanced to specialized training courses, and of those 20, only 12 were ultimately selected for deployment to anti-aircraft artillery regiments. These 12 represented the absolute elite, men whose hearing was exceptional even among blind people, men whose physical constitution could withstand the demands of the job, men whose psychological resilience could handle the stress, men who wanted to serve. Alexey Fedorovich Boyko was one of them. A factory worker before the war, he had been blind since childhood. His specific disability is not well documented in surviving records, but he had never known sight. His entire perceptual world was constructed through sound, touch, smell, and the other non-visual senses. This gave him advantages that people who lost sight later in life did not have. He had developed coping strategies from childhood. He had never known visual dependence. His mental map of the world was inherently acoustic and tactile. He was assigned to the 3rd Searchlight Company of the 89th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Regiment. Later, records show him serving with the Searchlight Battalion of the 84th Separate Anti-Aircraft Artillery Brigade. The apparent transfer between units was typical of the Soviet military during the war. Units were reorganized, merged, redesignated as operational requirements changed. What mattered was that Boyko remained in acoustic detection throughout the siege. His comrades remembered him as cheerful and sociable. This personality was not incidental. Operating in small units under severe stress requires psychological compatibility. A difficult or withdrawn personality would have created friction and degraded unit cohesion. Boyko's cheerfulness was a tactical asset. He played accordion. His music entertained other soldiers and provided moments of normalcy. He told jokes. He participated in unit social activities. He did not let blindness define him or isolate him. And when he took his position at the acoustic detector, he became something extraordinary, a weapon. The training was intensive and multifaceted. The 12 blind eavesdroppers had to learn more than just how to hear aircraft. They had to master the technical operation of complex acoustic equipment. This required understanding the mechanical principles of sound amplification and direction finding. They learned how the horns collected sound waves and focused them toward receivers. They learned how the azimuth and elevation mechanisms worked. They learned how to interpret the readings from calibrated scales that indicated the bearing of detected aircraft. They learned how to communicate this information in the standardized format that the integrated air defense system required. They learned to recognize the acoustic signatures of specific German aircraft types through extended classroom sessions with recordings, hour after hour of listening to engine sounds. The Junkers, Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, had a distinctive engine sound, different from the Junkers Ju-88 medium bomber. The instructors would play recordings and drill the students. What aircraft is this? The students had to identify it correctly and quickly. Speed mattered. In operational conditions, every second of delay in identification meant less warning time for the city's defenses. The Heinkel He-111 sounded different from both Junkers types. The Dornier Do-17, though less common over Leningrad, had its own signature. Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters had single engines that sounded distinct from larger bombers. Messerschmitt Bf-110 twin-engine fighters represented another acoustic pattern to memorize. Each aircraft type went into the mental library that the listeners were building. They had to know these sounds so thoroughly that identification became instant and automatic. Soviet aircraft signatures also had to be memorized. The Petliakov P-2 dive bomber, the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, the Tupolev SB-2 bomber, various fighter types. The consequences of misidentification were severe. If a listener mistook returning Soviet bombers for German raiders, the air defense system would waste ammunition and might even shoot down friendly aircraft. If they mistook German bombers for Soviet aircraft, the city would receive no warning and people would die. Accuracy was not optional. They learned to estimate distance by sound intensity and clarity. This was as much art as science. Sound attenuation through atmosphere follows physical principles, but local conditions affect propagation. Temperature gradients cause sound to refract. Wind carries sound or pushes against it. Humidity affects absorption. Skilled listeners developed an intuitive sense of how far away an aircraft was based on the character of the sound. Was it loud and clear or faint and muffled? Were high frequencies present or had they been absorbed by distance? This information, combined with known aircraft speeds, allowed estimation of time to target. They learned to function as part of an integrated air defense system. Each blind listener worked in partnership with a sighted assistant. This two-person team was the basic operational unit. The assistant would physically rotate the acoustic horns in the direction the listener indicated. Turn left. Slowly. Stop. The listener would fine-tune the bearing by having the assistant make minute adjustments. When the sound was perfectly balanced between both ears, the equipment was aimed directly at the aircraft. The assistant would then read the bearing from the calibrated scale and communicate it via telephone to searchlight crews and anti-aircraft batteries. The assistant operated the telephone, handled all the visual tasks, managed the paperwork, and provided physical support when needed. The blind soldier provided the critical capability, hearing. This division of labor was efficient. Neither person wasted time on tasks the other could perform better. The result was a team that exceeded what either individual could accomplish alone. The work was brutally difficult. Shifts lasted many hours, often extending through entire nights. The acoustic equipment was uncomfortable by design. Operators reclined in special chairs designed to keep their heads motionless, their heads pressed against leather headrests. The headrests were necessary to maintain consistent head position, which was critical for accurate sound localization. Any head movement relative to the acoustic horns would change the sound characteristics and degrade detection accuracy. Heavy headphones covered their ears. These were not modern lightweight headphones. They were substantial devices with large ear cups that provided sound isolation and held the receivers close to the ears. They pressed against the skull with significant force to maintain consistent positioning and prevent sound leakage. After hours of wear, they caused throbbing headaches. The pressure points where they rested became sore. But removing them or adjusting them too frequently would degrade performance, so the listeners endured the discomfort. They had to remain nearly motionless for hours at a time. Any movement could introduce noise. Clothing rustling, chair creaking, breathing too heavily. All of these sounds would be amplified by the acoustic detection system and could mask faint aircraft signatures. So the listeners learned to breathe quietly, to remain still, to become part of the equipment. This level of physical control required extraordinary discipline. For hours at a time, they listened to amplified sound through these headphones, slowly rotating the detection equipment to scan the entire sky. The scanning pattern was methodical. Start at one horizon, sweep across the sky at constant rate, reach the other horizon, adjust elevation slightly, sweep back. This ensured complete coverage of the airspace around Leningrad. But it required relentless concentration. Missing even a few seconds of a scan could allow aircraft to slip through undetected. The physical toll was severe. The headphones pressed against their skulls with enough force to cause throbbing headaches that would build over the course of a shift. The leather headrests forced their necks into positions that caused painful stiffness and created risk of chronic injury. The vertebrae in their necks were held at awkward angles for extended periods. Muscles would cramp. Remaining stationary for hours caused circulation problems, muscle aches, and general physical misery. The human body is not designed for this kind of sustained immobility. The cold of Leningrad's winter made everything worse. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. The winter of 1941-42, the first winter of the siege, was particularly brutal. Temperatures reached -40 degrees Celsius on some days. Metal equipment became painfully cold to touch. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes. The acoustic detection posts were outdoors or in unheated structures. There was no fuel to spare for heating listening posts when the entire city was freezing. The operators wore whatever cold weather gear was available, but their hands had to remain functional to operate equipment controls. Gloves thick enough to provide protection from the cold were too bulky to allow fine motor control, so they wore thinner gloves and accepted the numbness and pain. Their ears were covered by headphones, which provided some protection, but also trapped cold metal against their skin. Frostbite was a constant risk. Several of the listeners suffered cold injuries that caused permanent damage, yet the listeners had to maintain their positions, maintain their concentration, maintain their vigilance. Lives depended on it. This was not abstract. They knew that every aircraft they detected represented bombs that would fall on their city. Every minute of additional warning they could provide meant fewer people would die. The weight of this responsibility was immense. The psychological stress was equally demanding. They were listening for death. Every engine sound they detected represented bombers coming to kill civilians, to destroy the city, to advance Hitler's goal of reducing Leningrad to rubble. They could hear the explosions when the bombers arrived. Even through their headphones, even at their listening posts some distance from the city center, they could hear the bombs detonating, the sharper crack of smaller bombs, the prolonged rumble when something large collapsed. They heard the anti-aircraft fire, the rhythmic boom of 85mm and 76mm and guns firing at targets their early warning had enabled. They heard the screams sometimes when the wind carried sound in the wrong direction. And they knew that any lapse in their concentration, any missed detection, any error in identification would cost lives. They carried that weight every shift. The knowledge that human lives depended on their performance created psychological pressure that few people can truly understand. This was not a simulation or training exercise. This was reality. People would live or die based on how well they performed their job. That knowledge never left them. But they were extraordinarily effective. The blind eavesdroppers demonstrated capabilities that shocked even their commanders, who had expected improved performance but were unprepared for the degree of improvement. They could detect aircraft at ranges of 30 kilometers or more under good conditions. On some particularly clear nights, when atmospheric conditions were favorable and background noise was minimal, they could push detection ranges even further, 35 kilometers, occasionally more. This represented detection times approaching 20 minutes before bombers reached target areas. They could do this while the city was under active artillery bombardment, filtering out the explosive noise to focus on the specific acoustic signature of aircraft engines. German artillery shelled Leningrad constantly. Long-range guns fired from positions south of the city. The explosions created acoustic chaos, thunder rolling across the city, buildings collapsing, glass shattering, people screaming. Into this acoustic nightmare, the blind listeners had to detect the specific frequency signatures of aircraft engines dozens of kilometers away, and they did it, consistently. They could identify not just that aircraft were approaching, but what type of aircraft. This was tactically critical. Bombers required different defensive responses than fighters. Heavy bombers like the He-111 carried more ordnance and posed greater threat than light bombers or ground attack aircraft. Knowing what was coming allowed commanders to allocate their limited anti-aircraft resources with maximum efficiency. If heavy bombers were approaching, every available gun would be manned. If reconnaissance aircraft or single fighters were detected, resources could be conserved. They could sometimes estimate the number of aircraft in a formation. A single bomber has a specific acoustic signature. A formation of 10 bombers has 10 times the acoustic power, but the sound characteristics are different. The individual engine sounds blend and create interference patterns. The beat frequencies between engines that are not perfectly synchronized become more complex. Skilled listeners learned to hear these patterns and estimate formation size. While they could not always provide exact numbers, they could indicate whether a raid was a small strike by a few aircraft or a major attack by dozens of bombers. This information was critical for preparing appropriate defensive measures and alerting the civilian population. Most remarkably, they could distinguish between Soviet and German aircraft. This seems simple, but was actually extraordinarily difficult. Soviet bombers returning from missions on German positions flew over Leningrad regularly. They often returned at night, when acoustic detection was most critical because visual identification was impossible. If air defense forces could not differentiate between friendly and enemy aircraft, they faced an impossible choice: fire on everything and risk shooting down their own planes, or hold fire and allow German bombers through. The blind listeners solved this problem. They knew the acoustic signatures intimately. A Soviet Pa-2 dive bomber powered by twin VK-105 engines had a sound that was measurably different from a German Ju-87 powered by a single Jumo-211 engine. The differences were subtle: frequency spectra, harmonic structures, beat patterns. But the blind listeners could hear these differences. They could identify aircraft nationality before the aircraft came into visual range. This capability was invaluable. It allowed anti-aircraft guns to hold fire on friendly aircraft while engaging German raiders immediately. The impact on Leningrad's defense was immediate and measurable. Anti-aircraft batteries received earlier warning of incoming raids. This gave them critical extra minutes to prepare. Gun crews could be awakened if they were sleeping, could leave shelters if they were taking cover from artillery fire, could load ammunition, train their weapons, and achieve firing solutions before bombers arrived overhead. Those minutes meant the difference between being ready and being caught unprepared. Searchlight crews could power up their lights and focus them on the sectors where enemy aircraft would appear. Searchlights required time to warm up. The carbon arc lights used in Soviet searchlights did not reach full brightness instantly. They needed time to heat the electrodes and stabilize the arc. Early warning meant lights could be ready when needed. The searchlight crews also appreciated having accurate bearing information. Rather than sweeping the sky randomly, hoping to catch aircraft by chance, they could illuminate specific sectors where the acoustic detectors indicated aircraft would appear. Fighter aircraft could scramble with sufficient time to achieve altitude and intercept incoming raids. This was perhaps the most important benefit. Soviet fighters defending Leningrad operated under severe handicaps. Fuel was limited, spare parts were scarce. Maintenance was difficult under siege conditions. Every sortie had to count. Early warning from the blind listeners meant fighters could launch with enough time to climb to intercept altitude, navigate to the intercept point, and engage German bombers before they reached their targets. Without adequate warning, fighters would still be climbing when bombers released their ordnance and turned for home. With 15 or 20 minutes of warning, fighters could be at altitude and in position to inflict maximum damage on incoming raids. The early warning also saved civilian lives directly. Air raid sirens could sound with more lead time. The famous metronome broadcasts over Leningrad's loudspeaker system could switch from slow tempo to rapid tempo earlier, signaling citizens to take shelter. In a siege where 3,000 people per day were dying from starvation and bombardment at the worst points, where every life saved represented a small victory against Hitler's extermination plan, these minutes of additional warning mattered profoundly. People could reach shelters before bombs began falling. Basements of sturdy buildings, metro stations, purpose-built bomb shelters. Every minute of additional warning increased the percentage of the population that could reach safety. The mathematics of survival were brutal but simple. If bombs fell on a crowded street, casualties were massive. If bombs fell on an empty street because people had reached shelters, casualties were minimal. The blind listeners provided the time that allowed people to reach those shelters. Records from the 84th Separate Anti-Aircraft Artillery Brigade document Boyko's effectiveness with bureaucratic precision. His citation for medals reads, "The listener of the Searchlight Battalion, Lance Corporal Alexey Fedorovich Boyko, should be awarded for having achieved true mastery of his specialty with his selfless work. Despite his physical disability, complete blindness, he quickly takes his place on alert and always gives the exact coordinates of the target. With his direct participation, the crew illuminated and escorted the enemy aircraft 2 times. With his work, he shows an example to other fighters how to serve the motherland. He is an active participant in public life, carrying out active work among the personnel." 2 confirmed illuminations and escorts might seem modest by modern standards of military achievement, but these were only the directly credited instances where Boyko's specific contribution could be documented with certainty. He served throughout the siege. He provided early warning for countless raids. His accurate information contributed to dozens or hundreds of successful intercepts and anti-aircraft engagements. But because he was one component of an integrated system, his individual contribution was difficult to quantify precisely with the same precision one might credit kills to a fighter pilot or a tank commander. What mattered was that the system worked better with him than without him. That difference, multiplied across all 12 blind listeners, multiplied across 872 days of siege, added up to a decisive defensive advantage that helped save Leningrad. Remove the blind listeners, and Leningrad's air defense becomes measurably less effective. German bombers arrive with less warning. More bombs fall on civilians, more people die. The siege becomes even more catastrophic than it already was. This is how we should understand their contribution. Not as a curiosity or a heartwarming story about overcoming disability, but as a decisive military advantage that helped save Leningrad. They were force multipliers. Their exceptional hearing, combined with acoustic detection technology, created an early warning capability that gave Soviet air defenses critical extra time to respond to every raid. In warfare, time is often the most valuable resource. Minutes of additional warning can be the difference between interception and successful attack, between full shelters and crowded streets when bombs fall, between survival and death. The blind listeners provided those minutes consistently for nearly 3 years. They worked through starvation. They worked through winter cold that killed thousands of civilians who simply froze in their apartments. They worked through constant bombardment. They worked despite knowing that every raid they detected was bringing death toward their city. They maintained concentration, accuracy, and dedication when many people would have simply given up. This is heroism of a particular type. Not the dramatic heroism of charging enemy positions or flying combat missions, but the equally important heroism of doing your duty with excellence under impossible conditions. Day after day, week after week, month after month, for 872 days. They represent something profound about human capability and military effectiveness. We are adaptable, we are resourceful, and when circumstances demand it, we can transform perceived weakness into decisive strength. The blind listeners could not see, but they could hear what others could not. And in the darkness of the siege, in the horror of one of history's worst battles, that hearing saved lives. Their story is not about overcoming disability. It is about recognizing that disability is often just difference, and difference, properly applied, can be power. In Leningrad's darkest hours, 12 blind men turned darkness into advantage and silence into survival. They heard death approaching from 30 kilometers away, and they gave their city the time it needed to fight back.